Hawkeye. First off, I'm really glad we're reading this one. I wish I could be there with you guys to talk about this one face to face. I love this book. I think it's really awesome. It's written by a guy by the name of Matt Fraction. And it is drawn by a man by the name of David Aja. Now, these two guys had worked together previously on a book that was called The Immortal Iron Fist. And at the time, Matt Fraction was writing it fairly traditionally, where he would write exactly what he wanted in the script. He'd send it to David Aja, and David Aja would draw as close as he could to it. But for this book, Fraction said that he wanted to take a step back and let David Aja kind of have a little bit more creative control. So instead of telling him exactly what he wanted, he told him a basic concept and then let him kind of play around with it. But before we really get into the book, let's talk a little bit about Hawkeye in general. He's always had a real problem with identity. He started off as a villain, sort of a thief, sort of like Robin Hood, but instead of robbing the rich to give to the poor, he just kind of robbed from the rich. He originally, his origin is that he was orphaned at a young age, and he and his brother were trained at a traveling circus. He worked with a guy by the name of the Swordsman, and the Swordsman trained him in technically a bunch of different weapons, but he really excelled in the bow and arrow. His brother ended up being called a villain called Trickshot, but this is the Swordsman here. He was one of the original Avengers villains as well, kind of a symbol of Hawkeye's former criminal deeds. His original costume looked like the Last of the Mohicans costume. And here he is in one of his first appearances in Iron Man. He originally worked with the Black Widow, who was also a villain in Iron Man for a long time. And the two of them have always been kind of connected, possibly because of this original concept. And also she's another superhero with no superpowers. So these two are often seen together. And it was really paid attention when they made the Avengers film, putting these two right next to each other for most of the film and really playing up their relationship. The Hawkeye joined the Avengers in issue 16 of the Avengers. He was part of the new lineup that included the Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver and Captain America. And then he started dealing with the problem of how do you have a non-superhero powered character in a superhero team. So one of the ideas they came up with is to make him Goliath. So for years he was not actually Hawkeye. He was a super strong, large guy named Goliath who actually ended up being stuck as Goliath. Like he couldn't unshrink for a while. And he's always been kind of a jerk. Like for example in this scene, I've always dug you, girl, and I think it's time that we all hang out. That's a fairly good example of the problem with Hawkeye, is that he's always been super arrogant and kind of jerky. He's always been the Legolas of this group, and they've always kind of shown him that way. But for years he's been sort of a changing character when it came to his costume, often trying to deal with different problems. He also, interestingly enough, for a fairly long period of time, he was actually one of the few deaf superheroes. He hurt himself during an explosion, and he lost hearing for a significant amount of his career. It wasn't always played up, but for many people that was kind of one of the more interesting things about the character. And it's something that Matt Fraction eventually will bring into this comic. I don't think it shows up in the issues we're reading, but it does come back as a major part of it. He also started the West Coast Avengers, always kind of the weaker of the two Avengers. It didn't last for very long, but for a while it was a California-based Avengers team. He's also had a lot of love issue problems. His first wife, Mockingbird, got killed. Turns out that she was an alien or something silly like that. He also has had a real problem with stupid costumes. Here's one of his stupider costumes. Here's another stupid costume. Stupid costume. Kind of like getting this problem with his costumes. They finally kind of fixed him a little bit And then they did a series called Avengers Disassembled, in which he left the Avengers and then joined the Thunderbolts, and then came back to the Avengers, and just in time to be killed off in like one of the first stories of Avengers Disassembled. And so here he is getting killed off. But of course, whenever you have a character kill off, you can't keep that character dead for too long. And so after he died, they introduced a new Hawkeye, which was Kate Bishop. And this is the Kate that shows up in the comics. So when you read about Kate, that's where she comes from. Since Hawkeye was no longer around, she decided to become the new Hawkeye, and she used the name. And there's actually a backup in the issue that you've got where it shows their first meeting when basically Clint says, okay, you can keep the name. So even though he was apparently dead, turns out he wasn't dead because it's comic books and nobody ever dies. And so he introduces a mystery character called Ronan, who turns out to be Clint Barton in disguise. And so he fights some more, and he gets into a relationship with Spider-Woman, which is the Jessica character that eventually you're going to see. And he gets into a lot of fights and lots of problems. And at some point he got his own series, but every time he got his own series, it just didn't work. And so now here he is in this comic. So hopefully you will like it.